I see, recognize some faces from last year, and some new faces. Welcome, everyone. When I began giving talks a long time ago, I learned a very interesting process, which I started, and it was kind of a risky process, and when I first did it. And that was, I would sit silently, just listening. And it was more uncomfortable for the audience, I think, than it was for me. Everybody started wondering at some point, is he frozen up? Does he know what to say? Is he stuck there? You know, like the worst fear. And to some extent, that was exactly what I was looking for, because going through that experience brought about this amazing change within me. So the saying, of course, when you get on a stage and you're giving a talk and you can't think of what to say, it's called dying on stage, right? And it very much feels like that to the audience, watching this person. Nothing they can say, they're just stuck there. Everybody's feeling very uncomfortable about it. But that dying, when you go through that experience, and this is why I did it, everything opened up. This inner experience opened up, and awareness. It's like some days in a morning, if you get up really early before the day has started, and you realize, like a new day, it hasn't started yet. You can feel it, and it could go many different directions. It could take this direction to that direction. It's not like you've got someplace to go, you've got your whole day planned out. You're just kind of caught at this special feeling of that moment, because it's a new moment. The day is dawning. It's a very special feeling. And I've come to discover that it happens at certain times, like when something comes to an end. Perhaps a job comes to an end, or a project I've been working on comes to an end, or something comes to an end, and then you're at this moment where what's next? And anything could be next. You don't know what's going to be next. For a lot of people, that's very uncomfortable. And they immediately, like say, a job comes to an end. You've been working for a company for many years, and it comes to an end. Many people say, okay, I've immediately got to go out and get a new job. Very uncomfortable not having any job after having worked for many years. But it's those things, when they come to an end, I've come to see there's a very special time to just kind of feel that. It opens up. You get a sense of something. It puts things in perspective. It's a very interesting experience. And so dying on stage is one way of having that experience. I wouldn't suggest it to anyone. There is Rumi talks about, in his discourses, he's one case, Farzad and Mitra and I have quoted it quite often, but it refers to Uthman, one of the first speakers. He was being introduced as the new imam, and he comes up on the stage, and basically he says nothing, sits there, and the whole audience is waiting and waiting, and then this feeling comes through the whole audience, this awakening. And at the very end, he says his first words, and he says, it's much better to have a working imam than a speaking imam. And he leaves. So I was telling Mitra, I'm going to pull an Uthman. And she says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. But I think the thing that's so remarkable about it is how often we run away from those feelings that feel too much, or where our natural instinct is to fill the moment with words rather than silence. But in the silence, there's something there that if we can have the patience with it and die on stage, it really opens up. There was an author by the name of Paul Twitchell who wrote about something very close to this in his book, The Flute of God. And I wanted to quote it. He says, "There are always details that haunt me. Perhaps a painting in a gallery in a far-off foreign city, travels across a strange land where I have never been before, the face of a beautiful woman, or maybe a child reaching for a stick of candy. Each idea, like a bather lingering upon the beach at the water's edge, eager to take the plunge and yet fearful of the expected chill. It may be like a cathedral standing in the shadows of giant oaks. As I said before, I am haunted, perhaps haunted by the fact that beyond my concept of God, there is something else. The secret of all secrets, and not many know what that might be. I have had an opportunity to catch a glimpse of it, and for that very reason I feel haunted. Destined to walk this earth for centuries among the crowds of the great cities, over the majestic plains, through the jungles, by the rolling seas, and in the mountain heights, not looking for it, but seeking within myself that which opens the inner sight again to find it in its wonderful glory. The closest I can come to it, which I call the truth, is looking into the heart of a morning glory on some summer morning before the flower has closed its petals to the rays of the sunlight. Have you experienced this? My glimpse of the divine brings with it a strange sound of music with its glories, a marvelous melody sounding like a multitude of flutes. I have called it the Flute of God. That moment when the morning glory is open before it closes, because the sun is basically coming up and the day is dawning, that's when he felt that. I think he was talking about that same thing that I'm trying to talk about. It's a spiritual experience. It's a very spiritual feeling. But one of the things he says in there, he says he is haunted by this idea that there might be something way beyond his own understanding. And that's that feeling that comes with, in a sense, dying within yourself. Dying meaning, in a sense, like giving up. But this is interesting because there's a difference between giving in and giving up. If you're in a situation where somebody is making a very difficult situation for you, or perhaps your boss is telling you something you need to do, or some authority is saying something, it's very natural to say, okay, I give in. I'll go along with it. Not happy with it, but I'll go along with it. But giving up is giving up to something higher, giving up to something larger than yourself. That's the type of difference I'm talking to. That's the sort of experience between truly dying on stage and everybody does feel bad for you, and it turning into a beautiful, incredible opening up. That comes from giving up. Really knowing that something is going to come out of it, and trusting in the silence, and the waiting, and as it comes about. And these moments can come up in all kinds of times in your life, in all kinds of situations. Sometimes meeting somebody for the first time, perhaps somebody you wanted to meet, you wanted to talk to, and sometimes just the silence helps. Being silent, it opens it up. You get a sense of more who they are sometimes than saying something. So Rumi wrote a poem about this, and he describes it in a very beautiful way. And this is in our new book, which Farzad and Mitra helped me with. We worked together on it. It was quite an amazing experience working together. And this is one of those poems. Die, die, die in spiritual love. When you die in this love, you surrender to life. So this is what he's talking about. He's talking about this being willing to die in the situation. In a sense, losing yourself, not being so afraid of how awkward or how uncomfortable it is for yourself, but having this dying, truly dying. But he's specifically referring to this as spiritual love. And he's referring to it as spiritual love because in love, you lose yourself when you're with someone you really want to be with, or when you love the work you're doing so much you forget what time it is, you forget yourself. So this feeling of love is exactly where you lose yourself and you're willing to. And this is what he's referring to by dying. Then he goes on, die, die, and don't fear this death, because you conquer the heavens when you rise from this soil. So he's specifically saying that the inner worlds, the inner experience, the spiritual experience opens up from this experience of dying. And you actually rise beyond the physical experience, even beyond the human experience. It becomes a spiritual experience. It truly does open up. And of course, this is, to some extent, that pending feeling of dying is a fearful one. We avoid death. We avoid feeling of dying. Not just the end of our physical life, but the dying of ourself in a situation, the failing of something, being at the end of something. It's very uncomfortable when we bring an end, something comes to an end in our life, especially if it's something we've been doing and working on for a long time. So in all these cases, we run away from death, and Rumi's saying, don't run away. Run to it. Run to death. He says, die, die, and cut yourself off from ego, because ego is a trap, and you are all prisoners. Take an axe to this prison. Break free. Become kings and rulers over your own lives. The prison is the thing that keeps us from wanting to die. We run away from it, and we don't experience this opening up that comes. And it can be happening. Let's say, I talked about, sometimes you have these special moments in the early morning when the day is not yet formed and you realize it could go many different ways. You can feel that. There's something special about that moment. It's very different from the day you wake up and you realize, I got to do this, 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 and this before I leave, and I have to leave by this time, and you get it all planned out. And you miss that time. You miss that special feeling of the moment. And what Rumi is saying is, don't get caught in that prison. Break free. Die, die before the pole of the world. When you surrender to that spiritual master, you too will become spiritual travelers and masters. Now he's taking this into a very, more of a spiritual discussion. He says there's one you can look up to. Find one you can look up to that you can, in a sense, die to them or to that higher state. This is what I'm talking about, giving up. There is something more, something larger. Die, die, and rise above the clouds of this world. When you rise above these clouds, you become the light of the moon. He's talking about the spiritual experience. It is truly an inner opening. You feel it within yourself. Be silent. Be silent. Silence is death's voice. Because of your attachment to life, you run away from silence. So I might be wrong, but I think Rumi's saying the same thing I'm trying to talk about here. The running away from silence. And actually this feeling of dying, the fear of death, the awkwardness of that things might fail, all this, that's silence. And that is the voice of death. That is death speaking to us. Are we willing to listen? Are we willing to listen to that voice of silence? Because in that voice of silence, in that moment, before something has begun, after things have ended and there's just nothing formed, in that silence, are we willing to listen? Can we hear? And if we take the time to listen and hear, it opens up. And it brings about a whole inner change in our life. And the more we are willing to walk into that silence, and it says, make it our friend, it changes our life. And we reach a point where we suddenly realize we lose a fear of death itself. Because we are, in a sense, moving beyond with that experience. And it doesn't something we have to wait for to the end of our life. We can have these experiences all the time while we're still growing up. So what is the spiritual path? What is it? I got a letter from a young lady. She had moved from Peru to another country in South America. And she had read something I had written online, and she was it was talking about shedding, I think the article was called Shedding Your Skin. It's like, at some point, letting the old life go away to start a new life. And I had mentioned in there that some shamans have talked about that, used that as their language of shedding your skin. And that also, I had referred to the shamans, and one of the things they had said was that for someone who is like called to the path, the spiritual path, they must shed their skin, or else it's like they will start to get sick. They'll have problems unless they really do walk through and step through onto that path. In a sense, there's a feeling of they're afraid because it feels like a death, a dropping of an old life. And this, I learned this about shamans because I met one in the Seattle, Washington area. I was introduced by a friend, and he told his story, and it was very interesting. He himself had grown up on an Indian reservation, and he'd heard all the stories that they told in those times about the shamans and what they used to do. But he was, in the modern age, and he didn't think much about it. So he wanted to get far away from that. He ended up going to a university far away, didn't go back home except for visits occasional, and eventually became a professor. And he was working at the university, and then he starts finding that he's getting sick, and he doesn't know how to solve it. The doctors can't find anything wrong, but it was getting so bad he couldn't teach anymore. He was having problems, serious problems, and he didn't know what else to do. So one day, he decides, I guess I've tried everything else. I'm going to go talk to a shaman and see what they say. And he felt kind of silly about it because he thought he had left all that stuff behind. I was going backwards. He didn't want to go backwards. But he finally sits down with a shaman and he tells the shaman his story. And the shaman says, "You are going to die unless you accept the fact that you are a shaman." And he was totally shocked by this. And in a sense, what the shaman was saying to him was that you are called, and you are going to die if you don't take the right life, if you don't do something about this. I mean, that's how deep it is for some people, the need to know. You can't just push it aside. This need to know, this need to find something more in life than just the day-to-day stuff that is happening. It goes deep enough that you have to do something about it. You have to, do something. You can't just ignore it. You might try ignoring it. I know I did when I was young. And I suddenly realized I couldn't, things started happening. I had, serious problems until I realized I have to do something about this. And so that was the background of the story I had when I had written my article on. And this young lady who moved from Peru, she wrote to me and said she herself had felt herself being called and didn't know what to make of it. And it happened after she had a very serious experience, and that was she had a baby, and the young baby had a serious illness and died. And for her, of course, as you can imagine, it was a traumatic experience. It was like an end, major end of something. I mean, after all this time expecting the baby and looking forward to the baby, and then, before it's very old at all, it dies, and it's like, and at first, for her, it was a crushing experience. But she did not want it to go as an experience for nothing. She didn't want the whole thing to mean nothing. So she found a way to try and make something meaningful out of it, and this is when she suddenly realized she had to do something. She couldn't just go on. In a sense, like in a prison of a life that was nothing. She had to go on into a life that was something. It meant something. And she understood what I was saying in my article, that when you're called, you have to do something. You have to. You don't have a choice. And that was what she recognized in my words. And so she writes to me and she says, "Can you tell me what the spiritual path is?" Okay, I understand. I have to do something. I have to follow this path. But what is it? What is the spiritual path? And this is the interesting thing. You might say, you find out the spiritual path in the voice of silence, as Rumi said. It's not in a voice of words. And it's very easy for people to say, okay, the spiritual path is A, B, C, D, and lay it all out. But whatever is listed, A, B, C, D, all those things, they're really not the path. Those are things that are about the path. And to really know the path is to be able to, as I'm saying, experience the death of self, the old self, moving on. As Rumi said, dying in spiritual love. And then it begins to open up and awaken in your life. You begin to feel yourself changing. Things in your life seem to start happening that seem more meaningful than they had been before. Everything changes. Some part of you is now no longer in the prison. Now, much of your life may still seem like it's the same. That has not changed. But little by little, more of you seems to be outside that normal process. And something else is going on. Some part of you is awakening. So when somebody asks this question, what is the spiritual path? I remember back to my early days when I asked the same exact question. And I would ask different people that question, and I'd get different answers. So I started asking myself, what is the spiritual path? And I literally asked myself that for 6 months while I was having these experiences that were gradually opening up for me. And I finally realized that the only real answer to what is the spiritual path is, it is finding out what the spiritual path is. That's what the spiritual path is. You find out through experience. And there's really nothing else you can say. If you experience it, you know, you recognize it. It's bringing about a change from within yourself. It's more about remembering something you had forgotten than it is about learning something new. And with it comes a whole different way of seeing things, a way of understanding things. A different, almost like a different language, you might say. I wrote a short story. It's fairly short, and this is in my book, The Silent Questions, but I thought it's appropriate. It's called The Boy and the Sea. And in this story, everything is symbolic of the spiritual. The sea, in this case, represents the spiritual. So, a young boy sat on the edge of the wharf, looking out over the gray water. His legs dangled free in the air, kicking back and forth. This was the place where he sat every day to listen to the sounds that the wind carried and to watch the way the waves danced. The sea was his friend, and he came to visit, just as he visited the geese in Mrs. Thatcher's yard and the seagulls behind Mr. Danvers' fish market. But the sea was different. The sea seemed changed every day, and yet somehow was exactly the same. It seemed endless and huge, yet at times you forgot it was even there, and it would startle you when you noticed it again. The boy felt small when he played on the shore, looking for stones and shells. He knew what the seagulls must feel like when he watched them, picking at their pieces of fish, because the sea had a presence. And at times he felt that it was really the sea who was visiting him, to see how he grew and changed every day. Perhaps this was why the boy thought that the sea was ancient and wise, and that it knew the answers to the questions he might ask. Maybe this was what drew him into talking with an old sea captain who he'd never seen before. "How far is it to the other side of the sea?" the boy asked, his thoughts filled with images of the exotic lands that might exist there. "The sea is the sea," said the captain. "It has no sides. Only land has sides." "You mean it goes on forever?" "Yes," the captain answered, "with little bits of land along the way." "But Mr. Danvers said the ships have sailed all the world and explored all the sea," the boy said, not quite sure. "Haven't they?" The captain was rewinding a new coil of rope the way he liked it, so it would flow smoothly and not catch or kink. He looked at the boy. "How can you tell if you have been to a certain place in the sea? The sea has no places. It only has water and waves and a rhythm, and it has a voice too, if you know how to listen." "Yes, you could say I'm about halfway between Hawaii and Japan, for example, but those are land places, not sea places. You can spot the stars and watch the sun, but those are sky places." People forget that this world is mostly sea. But the sea is always moving. It is not the same sea here today as when I was last here 15 years ago. That was a stormy sea, too wild even for the whales. So how can anyone say they have seen all the sea? The sea is endless and always moving. Only the shores can be known. The boy sat there kicking his legs, wondering why he'd always thought this was the same sea each day that greeted him. But Earth doesn't go on forever, the boy said, still thinking and trying to understand. So how can the sea go on forever? You are still thinking land-wise, the captain answered. But when you are out upon the sea, with no land in sight and only the stars in the sky, then the sea is forever. It has no places and it has no time except night and day. These people who try to figure out the sea with their science and books, what do they know? They go to work every morning. They go to some place and come back to their home every night. They listen to the clocks telling them the time. They follow their roads to the cities and stores, and these places are always there. They never move. It is easy to be sure about things that never change. And so they make maps, millions of maps, but only land maps, with names that fool people like the Indian Ocean or the North China Sea. What do they know of the North China Sea? It is not one, but 1,000 seas, churning together, making new seas every day. They know the land, so they think they know the sea. The sea laughs at their maps. Is that why people can't live out on the sea forever and have to always come back ashore? Because they can't understand the sea, and the sea thinks they are a bunch of pretty pusses? The captain laughed. Yes, I think you're right. But you have lived for a long time on the sea, haven't you? The boy asked. Yes, the captain said, feeling very old. Where are you going next? I don't know yet, the captain said. My ship is for hire. How long will you be out on the sea? That depends, said the captain. On who I take, of course. Would you take me? Asked the boy. The captain smiled. Sure, he said. How long would it be then? The captain paused. He looked at the boy and then at the sea. His thoughts rushed out far across time and across his memories. He thought of the years. It would be a long, long time, he said to the boy. To answer the questions that you ask about the sea would never be a short journey. The boy looked out at the horizon. Suddenly his legs stopped and hung motionless. He watched a seagull flying back to shore. He stood up slowly and looked at the captain. When I am older, I think I will go out to sea. Then he ran up the wharf toward town. The captain understood the depth and wisdom of that decision, for he too had once been such a boy, and he knew that when it was time, the sea would send a teacher. So much of our language, when we talk about asking a question, what is the spiritual path? Those are land words we're looking for. We're looking for the things that aren't changing, and how do we fit the understanding of the spiritual path in concrete terms. And that is not the same as the spiritual path, because it uses sea language. It uses the language of things that are alive and changing all the time. These experiences can start in the simplest ways. And you never know, but they usually come at times where a person's life and all has come to an end in some stage, and they're facing something new, really a new life. It's time for a new life, and it comes to them then. I was running an engineering department many years ago, and I had a technician who came to me one day with a dream he had. And I was a little surprised he approached me with a dream, since we hadn't talked about spiritual things during work, but somehow he had a sense that I might be able to explain his dream. And he he came to me and he basically told the dream, and it went something along like this. Basically, the first part of the dream, he saw himself, he was wearing some kind of a uniform, and he was on the ground with a gun in his hand, and he was creeping up a hill, and he looked over and he saw this whole army facing him, and he saw this missile coming, like a bomb coming. And just before the bomb hit was coming right where he was at, the dream shifted. And the dream shifted to him being on a ship. And he's at sea, and he's feeling very much at home, taking care of the ship and raising the sails, and there's this major storm comes along. Huge storm. And it's just tearing apart the ship, ripping it apart. The ship is flipping over, and the dream changes again. And he's an old man, lying in a bed, thinking about his life that he had had. He had had this whole life, and he's thinking about it. And he's realizing it's coming to the end of his life. He's feeling sick, and he had another shift in his dream. But the point of each of these shifts was obvious to me when he was telling me the dream, but he didn't see it. So I said to him, he asked me, I said, well, it seems like the dream is saying that these are like past lifetimes you've had, experiences of death. In each of those situations, you were just about ready to die. And he says to me, he says, well, I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in that. I said to him, well, then imagine the dreams are saying it's as if you lived before. He said, okay, I can accept that, he said. Then I said to him, I says, it seems to me that what your dream is suggesting is that you've had a fear of death. Something you've been thinking about recently has brought about this fear of death. And the dreams are saying, it's okay, you'll live. Things will go on, life will go on. And he really stopped. It was like his eyes stopped when I said that. He was like looking at me like, how could you know? You know, and I didn't know. I just saying, this is what the dream is saying. And he said, yes, he says, I have been thinking about it. He had just had a baby boy, and he was wondering what would happen if he died. Who would take care of the boy? So this is why this thought of death had come up out of nowhere. So here you have a new beginning, a baby boy. Life is changing. He's now a father. He now is coming to realize he has all new responsibilities. And this is when these kinds of experiences come to awaken us that there is so much more. And in this case, showing him that life does go on. There is more to life. He could accept that as a dream. He couldn't accept the idea of past lives, but that's okay. Those things like terms like past lives, those are land terms after all. And we're talking spiritual, we're talking about things that are much more alive and meaningful from the inside of us. What do they mean to us? And that's the way the dreams speak to us, that same way. Shortly after this, not long after this, he had another awakening. And this one I wrote about in my book, The Whole Truth, and I thought it was interesting to share here because I think it talks again about the same experience. Many years ago, a friend I worked with came to my office near the end of the day to talk. He had recently joined the Mormon church after his marriage to a Mormon woman, and he found the religion helping him focus his life. He could see that he had been without direction before and now found a sense of purpose and meaning. However, being an engineer, he was having problems dealing with the Mormon doctrine. It was a problem is this logical? This isn't logical, you know. And he's telling me some of the problems that he found with it. I listened as he explained the parts he found contradictory. He tried to reason through his concerns, but he was clearly troubled by some of the teachings. I offered a few thoughts to help him, but I could see that although my words were answering an inner part of his unconscious, his conscious mind was still struggling with the conflict. That night, he had a dream. As he told me the next morning, during his dream, he was still wrangling with the logical contradictions of his teaching when he saw someone approaching. As he looked closer, he realized it was Jesus walking towards him. Standing before Jesus, who was glowing radiantly, all of my friend's concerns and anguish came pouring out. He found himself asking Jesus for help. Jesus smiled and very quietly said, "It's all poetry." My friend stood there in his dream trying to understand what this meant when Jesus waved his hands in a huge sweeping circle and repeated, "It's all poetry." All at once, my friend understood. Something beyond words had been communicated to him. Not only was the written doctrine poetry, but all of life, all existence. It was all poetry. In other words, the religious doctrines should not be read literally, because life is not literal. Everything spoken, everything that happens in an expression of spirit, is an expression of spirit. My friend was suddenly seeing the world through the eyes of soul. So it started with a baby boy, his life changing, everything changing within himself, brings him to this experience of death, facing the death and realizing that there was something beyond death. He has this awakening. And Jesus himself tells him, it's all poetry. All of it. And this is, when we come to the things in our life, how often do we realize that? How often do we go through our daily lives having experiences we think, oh, why is this happening? Well, why am I going through this? Or even more personally, why me? You know, why is this happening to me? And yet, if we can sit in the stillness with that moment, with the situation, we can suddenly realize that there was a poetic aspect to it. There was some true poetry behind that situation that we hadn't seen before, that gives it meaning, that makes it more meaningful than we realized. And this explains so much the experience of life in a way that's enlivening. It truly awakening to have that experience. And it's nothing like the life before you have that. It's totally different. You realize it's, you know, people use the term being born again. They have all kinds of terms to describe this. Those are land terms. But they do describe something that has to do with, because you feel like you've left an old life behind and you've begun something new. But this new life is outside and beyond more than what you had before. And this, once again, I call this a spiritual path. It's not tied to any land places or land terms or land doctrines. It's just a word. It's like the sea. It just is the sea, and it is what it is. And we only get to know it by experiencing it. If you look at so much of what is happening in the world today, you see a lot of very difficult things going on. And for a lot of people, it's too much. There is a very strong feeling amongst a lot of people these days that things are not right, that this is not the way things should be. And, but everybody disagrees on the way it should be. So you have very serious political battles because everybody could say there's one thing they all agree on, that it needs to change, it needs to be fixed. But they disagree on how to fix it. So you have all these battles going on. But if you really get to the root of what's happening, in a lot of cases, when you're young and you're growing up, you learn the world as it is when you're young, and you're familiar with it. It makes sense to you as you are then. And when the world changes, it's like it's not the same sea anymore. And you want it to be the same sea because you knew that world, but you don't have the right lens to understand this new world. It doesn't make sense to you because you didn't grow up with it. You don't understand it the way you did. And so a lot of people are trying to go back in some way to what they knew when they were growing up. And it's a fear of death, of dying in the old life, of really letting the old life go to find the life that exists for them in the new world, the world they are in now. Because there's just as much beauty and amazing spiritual experience in this new life. We were talking the other day about how in many religions it's talked about the spiritual life is like something that existed back hundreds of years ago when the saints or the prophets were alive, or biblical times. Yeah, they had spiritual experiences. They had them all the time, but not today. We don't have those kinds of experiences anymore. But a lot of that is for those who are living in this life and not getting outside of the day-to-day life, not moving into the spiritual, not the spiritual experiences that really move us into something more. So I think a lot of these people who have such a strong feeling about the world being wrong, there's something wrong with it, being fixed, it's really a reflection of themselves. Something within themselves needs to be fixed. And what needs to be fixed is, in a sense, dying and letting go of all those old feelings of what life should be like and discovering again what life is now. And seeing that the spiritual life exists now as it did when you were young, as a kid. And life seemed natural. It's just as natural now. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about all this, so we're talking about this dying in spiritual love, as Rumi called it, is that we face difficult situations in our life, and when we face these and go through these difficult situations, they kind of beat us down sometimes. We feel, we worked hard at something, we really believed in something, and then it failed. And it's easy then to give in and think, oh, I should not be so idealistic. I should not be trying to do too much, or I should give up some of those ideas. And it's really a giving in. And what happens in each time that experience has that arc of failure, or something going bad, or something going wrong, or not feeling restricted. You're not allowed to do what you want to do in a certain situation, and you give in. It leaves a certain amount of energy in you that gets locked, frozen. It's not flowing. If you have the different arc is, you tried something, it's risky. It may not go the way you want. It may not work, but you feel inspired enough to try another way. And then maybe that one works. Or maybe it fails again, and somehow the person tries again, hasn't given up, and then eventually they find success. Now, what is their experience? Their experience is they learned a different lesson completely. not to give in, but to never give in. And in a sense, the lesson in this is the same as the spiritual lesson that I was talking about from the very beginning of this talk, and that is this moment you face when something is difficult, when something is a challenge, that it is an experience of death, like a spiritual death, and it is something, if we face that, if we're really willing to go along with that, trust it, you might say, and give up to something larger, then it changes, and it takes that different arc. It becomes something meaningful. It's not a failure. Following our dreams is something we often talk about. But to really follow your dreams, the life in your dreams, means to come to it, those dreams come to an end at some point. The life continues. There's a part of us that we pursue our dreams, we come to a certain point, we accomplish that, but then there's something more beyond that for us. So we have to let go of that dream. It's not as if, though, we're letting go of the dream, but the dream itself is changing, and the dream is saying, come, come. You know, I've changed. Can't you see? It's still me, but we get stuck with the old dreams. And it's time to let go. And that's the experience that makes it meaningful, when we let go. So what's happening so much, we see so much sorrow in the world. So much of it is because of this unwillingness to die in spiritual love, to really let go and give up in a spiritual sense. At the same time as this is happening on a social basis in the world, the same thing happens in our bodies. When we go through a traumatic experience, like a car accident, the cells in our body actually have a very similar reaction. Energy gets locked in. And this is why these people who will have dreams of that experience over and over again, if they had a car accident, and they'll be troubled by it. They'll feel unconsciously that something's wrong with them. So they're not, something's not right. What they don't realize is that really what's not right is their body. The cells in their body have not learned to let go, and some of that energy got locked up, got frozen. And this is what trauma is about. It's the same lesson, but in the case with our bodies and what the trauma we go through, it's our job to help lead our bodies out of that trauma, to help our bodies get over that experience, to say, it's okay, life goes on. It's like having these memories, my friend who had these memories in his dream of dying over and over again. After you have that dying over and over and over and over and over again, eventually you realize, okay, it's just dying. It's just dying. So our cells actually die regularly. All the cells in our body, I don't know, somebody said 7 years, they're all replaced. It's whatever period of time it is. They're all growing old and dying and giving up. But we can help overcome some of this thing. So I have here a person who talked about healing trauma. This is a psychologist who has helped a lot of patients, and he's talking about his own experience. And when I'm talking about this, compare how this is to what I was talking about with the spiritual death. A herd of impala grazes peacefully in a lush wadi. Suddenly the wind shifts, carrying with it a new but familiar scent. The impala sense danger in the air and become incessantly tensed to a hair trigger of alertness. They sniff, look, and listen carefully for a few moments. But when no threat appears, the animals return to their grazing, relaxed yet vigilant. Seizing the moment, a stalking cheetah leaps from its cover of dense shrubbery. As if it were one organism, the herd springs quickly toward a protective thicket at the wadi's edge. One young impala trips for a split second, then recovers, but it is too late. In a blur, the cheetah lunges towards its intended victim, and the chase is on at a blazing 60 to 70 miles per hour. At the moment of contact, or just before, the young impala falls to the ground, surrendering to its impending death. Yet it may be uninjured. It has instinctively entered into an altered state of consciousness shared by all mammals when death appears imminent. Many indigenous peoples view this phenomena as a surrender of the spirit of the prey to the predator, which, in a manner of speaking, it is. Physiologists call this altered state the immobility or freezing response. It is one of the three primary responses available to reptiles and mammals when faced with an overwhelming threat. The other two, fight and flight, are much more familiar to most of us. Less is known about the immobility response. However, my work over the last 25 years has led me to believe that it is the single most important factor in uncovering the mystery of human trauma. Most cultures tend to judge this instinctive surrender in the face of overwhelming threat as a weakness, tantamount to cowardice. However, underneath this judgment lies a deep human fear of immobility. We dread it because it is a state very similar to death. This avoidance is understandable, but we pay dearly for it. This physiological evidence clearly shows that the ability to go into and come out of this natural response is the key to avoiding the debilitating effects of trauma. It is a gift to us from the wild. That similarity to the experience of death and the fear of death, the reason people feel it's cowardice to enter the state of giving up is because of an inherent fear of dying, the inherent fear of that death experience. And yet that is the real change that brings about, that changes that experience. In the case of an impala that's being attacked, maybe its giving up is just the right thing because it is time to die. Maybe that is, but he's not going. That won't go through the physical trauma if it has given up and moved on already. But as the author explains here, many cases, the cheetah or the lion or the tiger or whatever who's attacking, it maybe gets distracted while the impala is lying there motionless as if it's dead. Gets distracted, and the impala then gets right up, runs immediately, jumps out of that stage immediately when he realizes it's time. This moving in and out of it. And this, the reason this is so important, we're talking about very physical things here. Things in our body that get stuck in energy and experiences we face that are traumatic, very, very difficult. They often leave us with a part of it within us unresolved. And so much of life, for many people, is a part of them is crippled. Part of them is still held in back of failures or strong negative experiences. And what they're looking for is a way to kind of escape that prison, get beyond that. And this spiritual, dying in spiritual death, in spiritual love, this is the answer not only at the spiritual level, but in all of our life. It is the awakening things that releases us. This author goes on and talks about what it meant to this one woman who had come in to his office feeling just trauma. Obviously, it had been a traumatic experience she had gone through. She couldn't even remember what it was, but she had fears of so many things, she couldn't leave her house. And while he was talking he thought, okay, maybe this is at the very beginning when this same author was first learning about trauma. He sat her down, he says, okay, let's do some kind of relaxation thing. And apparently that turned out to be exactly the worst thing, because now she really panicked. She had a full-blown panic attack. And so he didn't know what else to do. He's thinking, oh no, now I made things worse. He said she totally froze up, just could not move. Her breathing was stopped. He wondered if her heart was stopped. He'd think, what have I done? Now, he's fearing. He feels the fear that she's feeling. And he's thinking, and suddenly he has this image of a tiger. And the tiger is coming, and he says to her, a tiger is coming. Run, climb the tree, get away. And she said, instinctively, her body started moving, her legs started moving. And suddenly, she was out of the experience. She had moved from the state of giving up to the state of doing, naturally. She wasn't stuck in that state of giving up. And after that, all of her experiences went away. All those, and she said she felt like her old self had returned, releasing herself. The spiritual experience is like you find your true self, a self you didn't know you had. And so much of our life in this physical world is harsh, difficult, it's unbending. Rumi calls it's like ice. It's frozen, it's solid. Whereas the spiritual life is about flow. Everything flows, everything's moving. One thing moves from one thing to the next, our experiences. If you read Rumi's poetry, you realize he's saying one thing, and then he's suddenly saying something else completely different. He's moving, flowing, continually, moving from one into the next. That is what comes from facing the experience of death, the experience of the silence, and looking into the silence. I want to end with this poem from Rumi, and then we can have some dialogue after this. This time, this is also from the book. This time I'm completely immersed. I'm completely immersed in being a lover. This time I've cut myself off from being safe. I've abandoned myself. I'm alive with something else. I have burned out the roots of mind, feelings, and thought. Oh people, I can't be like you. Even a madman could never imagine what's in my heart. He'd lose his shoes trying to run away from my ecstasy. I've embraced death and leapt into nothingness. Today, all at once, my mind became weary of me. It tried to scare me, as if I've never seen this before. Why would I fear it? I made myself for this. How could I become lost when I intended to be lost? I'm free of this bowl of stars and the lineage of the heavens, but for the sake of beggars, I've been hungry a lot. Now, up until this point, what he was talking about is exactly what we've been talking about. I've been talking about in this talk. He can't live the life, drudgery life that he can't live that way. He can't. because he's thrown himself into the experience of death, the dying experience, and become nothing. He's lost himself in it. And the experience of life, the spiritual flow of life that he experiences with that, is his life now. But now in this part where he talks about, I am free of this bowl of stars and the lineage of heavens. He's freed of this world. He's grown out of there. He's expanded beyond it. He says, but for the sake of beggars, I've been hungry a lot. Beggars, he's talking about others who are hungering to find the spiritual life. I'm in the prison of this world for a good reason. Why prison for me? What have I stolen? This body's a prison full of blood. Taking the tears of rebels, I cleanse their clothes, soaked with suffering. He is in the body, experiencing the suffering, but he's not doing it for himself. He realized he's come here to do this for the sake of others. Think about the change that is. Instead of looking at your suffering in your life, think about it, that the suffering you're doing, you're not just doing for yourself, you're doing it for others. That makes it the meaning. That gives you a meaning to what you're doing. Like an unborn child in the womb, from blood I grow. A human's born once, but I've been born many times. Been born many times. It's not just a reference to past lives. It's dying over and over. Each time dying, being born again and again. Look at me as much as you want. You'll never know me because I've changed 100 ways from whatever you saw. Look at how I see. See through my eyes. I dwell in this place beyond seeing. You're all drunken and joyful. I've lost my head in ecstasy. You're all lovers with laughing lips. I laugh with no mouth. I'm a charming bird who left the garden of my own free will. Without traps or hunters, I crawled into the cage. Because being in a cage with friends is better than being free in the garden. For the contentment of the Josephs, I wait in this well. He's talking about Joseph, the prophet, who was thrown into a well by his brothers who were envious of him. This is before he realized who he was to become. And what Rumi is saying is, he is in this world, in this jail, for the sake of the Josephs, for those who have not recognized yet that they are called to the path, that they have not yet discovered, but they are wanting to awaken as well. Don't cry for their wounds. Don't exaggerate their illness. I've sacrificed hundreds of dear lives to bear this suffering. Enter suffering like a silkworm enters a cocoon. Listen to the tale of the silkworm wearing out its robe. Rumi is talking about exactly what I've been talking about here. And in this case, he says the suffering is the doorway. The suffering is the way for the transformation. All those traumatic experiences, all those difficult challenges, all those hardships, all the suffering is exactly what can bring about the new birth, the new life, the awakening. He ends the poem this way. You're falling apart in this grave of the body. Go ask the angel Seraph to blow his trumpet for your sake, because it's time to arise. He's saying that this time now, especially if you've grown tired of the way life seems to go on and beat you down, it's time to awaken. It's time to die and jump into that experience and lose everything. And that's how life begins again. Okay, I've raised a number of interesting subjects here, crossed the arc of the story, kind of crossed a number of things. I thought I would really like to have some kind of a dialogue now. We have some questions and answers. And what I would especially like to see is if the dialogue could be the kinds of questions that aren't just for yourself, but for the sake of others. That would be meaningful for others as well. Because my experience has been dialogue can be truly magical when it's done with a larger purpose like that. Yes?
What's a smart way to throw yourself outside of your comfort zone in a way? Like, throw yourself into the darkness, but do it in a smart way. Because progress just for the sake of progress sometimes isn't that satisfying. How to know when and how you should put yourself outside of this comfort zone?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, one of the most amazing things is we don't have to artificially create those situations for us. Life has a way of bringing those experiences to us. And the most important thing is to recognize how often we face uncomfortable situations and don't even recognize the opportunity that they face. It's so easy to, they happen all the time. All the time we feel something uncomfortable and find some excuse for, oh, that was their problem, or that was not recognizing we're the one who's feeling uncomfortable about the situation. So I'd say the first place is actually to see how often it happens, much more often than we realize, and facing it as it happens naturally, and not having to seek it out. You know, there are people that do go and, they get a thrill out of thrilling experiences, dangerous. They want to climb the highest mountain or that sort of thing, to looking for that experiences. We don't actually have to go looking for them. They come to us. And the more you walk along the spiritual path, the more you will find that happening. This might be strange. We were talking about this last night. The question, why do you see some of these really advanced spiritual people having such difficult experiences? But the fact is, it's not that the more advanced a person becomes spiritually, the more difficult their life gets, because their life is expanded in ways. They take on responsibilities. They become involved with life at a deeper level, and it brings about more difficult experiences. However, another answer to your question, being spontaneous is really a very important thing. It's this way of move in and out of these states, being instead of being frozen in a state of not knowing what to do. One of the best ways is learning to act spontaneously. When the very first thought of something to do enters, just doing it without you really thinking about it. Just do it immediately. Learning that, it can be on the simplest things. Just learning to act that way. From the first moment you wake up to at any time, it could just be a sudden urge. Follow the urge, do it. And what you learn from that, what you do isn't always the right thing, but what you learn from that is how naturally it flows. It flows with a naturalness that, but you have to also be willing to trust. It's very trusting. The idea of the spiritual path, we often picture it's a path, it's already paved, maybe millions and millions of people have walked it. But that's not actually, those are land paths. And the sea paths aren't like that. The path forms as you're taking your step. So, yes?
Well, since Rumi 750 years ago and prior to Rumi, there's been many other spiritual teachers and even after him. So you would think by now, these kinds of spiritual teachings should have had a more influence in our educational system today. How come so much lack of?
Yeah, so, I mean, with all this he brought out all these years, why don't we see it more in our educational system? Why wasn't it talked?
You also being in an education system, what would you recommend that could be done to make some change in that?
Yeah, I think if you look at most of our educational system, it's mostly about land places, right?
For survival.
Yeah, it's teaching the things to be learned that are fixed, that are solid, that stay the same. The things that Rumi was teaching about was the things that you can't nail down, the things that are, and those are things that are learned through experience. And you can't teach someone that. They have to go through it for themselves. So the spiritual path, when you really look at it, is an individual experience, different for each person. And it starts wherever you're at in your life. And that's totally different from bringing kids in all at the same age and thinking you have something to teach them all. It doesn't fit that way. So you might say there's another educational system going on, and it's called life. And that's why we're here in this world, to learn. Life is about learning. And so the good thing about life being about learning is you can't fail. Because failing is just more learning.
I understand what you mean, but the same understanding of the die that you
Yes.
tried to explain.
What I'm talking about here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are two different levels of die. The physical die that, when you say Bemiri, Danim Esh, Bemiri, the same one that you translated beautifully and expanded on. So we, in our day-to-day life and experiences in education, have an understanding of Bemiri. It's just like a physical death, and they put you 6 feet under, and that's the Bemiri that we understand. But then the way that you also explain this is also a bit of an education, and there's also, there's another Bemiri, and that die to your egotistic or, the elusive me that you built in your system. So maybe that can die. And that could be in some part of the educational system too. That's what I mean. At least a bit of it to open the gateway to the rest of life experience for the rest.
So if you look back historically, you'll see that all of our modern civilizations have gone through a major change with the introduction of science and the way of seeing things with scientific eyes. The science sees things objectively, the world out there, as if it exists independently, which if you get down to quantum physics levels, you find that that doesn't hold up. Things don't actually exist that way. But that's this old science, the science that, the mechanical science, you might say, what's called classical science. We learned that, and it has hugely influenced our society. Much of our modern world, the projectors with screens, the microphones, our computers, our cell phones, all that's all as a result of this objective science. And so our world is changing dramatically because of that. But what we haven't brought along with us is the understanding of ourself, understanding of soul, of who we are and what is possible with us. And so in many ways, we're surrounded by a world that's not our world. It's this outer world that we've created. But it brought about a huge change. And if you look back historically, you'll see that the people who were involved with making this change, look at the industrial age, when they first started creating machines to do the work on farms, or the work of making clothes, or all these other things that they use them for. It changed people's lives, and they wanted to help develop those things for their future generations. They realized they were at an exciting time of something new that they were creating that was going to help relieve people of this burden of all this work that had to be done. So for them, it was a spiritual new age. That came with that. But where did it lead? Did it lead to more spiritual awakening or a physical sense of creation? And I think we're at a new age now. And now we're looking at a planet with so many people on it that we are affecting nature. And we can't just ignore that anymore. But this is not the world that a lot of people grew up in, right? The world is different. So these things, I think that what you'll see in the next 100 years is a totally different sense is coming because we're faced with a major situation. And that brings about this struggle that brings about a spiritual awakening that comes with that struggle. And what we've seen so far has been this huge development of science and knowledge. And what we need is spiritual wisdom.
So life knows how to bring the next challenge on board to
Yes, exactly. Life exactly has delivered the exact experience we need. And that's the thing. If people can start realizing that all these difficult problems that we face are opportunities, these are all things that are spiritual lessons in all of them, there can be this spiritual awakening that can spread. And it does. When you experience it yourself, it affects those around you. And that makes more of a difference than anything. So instead of teaching it, experiencing it, and doing it not just for yourself, that makes it more meaningful. And that does actually have an effect. Yeah. Yes?
So do you think that he has a view to transmigration, and what was his opinion about it?
He actually has a number of famous things he's said about transmigrations. And he talks about, for example, I was born a plant, and then I became an animal, and then I died as an animal. I became, he goes on, and of course that story goes on not just as plant and animal and then human, and then beyond that he says angel. I was born an angel, then I died. He goes on, and in his discourses he talks about it. He says, the point of this experience is for us to realize that this is not all there is. That is the point. Wherever we are, there is always more. And so that, now does he mean literal death, or is he talking about something else? I think he actually meant it in many levels. That was true at many levels. So he would say that is about transmigration, and he saw he could see life forms at a low level having their own spiritual experiences until they're ready, and then they die and move into a larger life form. So, but that's my interpretation. Yes?
Just want to use some words on the spiritual path that we try to explain. It's very difficult to put it in the word, to explain or define it. But something that, first of all, this spiritual path has to be experienced by individual. You cannot teach, you cannot educate, and every single person has to be on that path in order to touch it. What Rumi is saying, instead of the point, die, the human lives in two different environments. One is related to three dimensions, which is the body, and also all phenomena in the whole universe is a three dimension. Dying in this three dimension means cutting off your egos. Cutting off the egos is not eliminating the egos. You've got to balance it. Once you balance it in this three dimension, then the fourth dimension of the human, which is spiritual path, is open. It's going to be open.
Yeah.
And it happens to Rumi.
Yes.
When he was Indian market, when he encountered Shams, Shams just asked one question, just one question. That question opened up the fourth dimension of the room and became room and experienced every single phenomenon in the fourth spiritual, So that's, I put in the three dimension and fourth dimension because distinguishment is very easy to explain because you cannot explain, you cannot define with the word. So that's why you have to simulate with three dimension and fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension is the spiritual, that is the fully awareness. It's a state of fully awareness. So you cannot bullshit.
It's what you're saying is interesting because one of the poems we have coming out in our new book, Rumi, we have a quote from in this poem where he says, "Mind says there is only three dimensions and nothing else. Love says, no, there's more, and I've been there many times. Love knows the way out. Love, this dying in the spiritual love, is the way out of this third dimension, the three dimensions, as you say. It's almost exactly what you're saying. And I think the other way to look at it is not just that it's a fourth dimension, but it is a whole ocean of dimensions. It's a whole ocean of new experiences. It's like dimensions upon dimensions upon dimensions. So but I completely agree with you. That there are ways we can talk about this. If people can relate to it, if they've had some experiences, then they can catch what we're saying. But it's very hard if they haven't had that experience. And Rumi talks about that in one of his discourses, where he says that the people that come into his class, they want to hear some great words of wisdom from Rumi, who was famous in his own time. And he realizes that some of them are not ready for it. So he has to hold back. And he says, then they're not happy if we hold back. But we can only tell them what's appropriate for them. And so that's the challenge, is always being able to find. So when somebody asks me a question, I have to always think, what are they looking for? What is they're asking? What is the spiritual path? It can mean many different things depending on who they are and where they're at. So, but in every case, it's like you say, it's another dimension. It is, yeah, in every case. Yes. Go ahead.
It's great to see you again, talking Toronto. So there's on this talk on your point about dialogue, Chinese dialogue. For a couple of years I did study Asnavi. One of the main points that I had, fundamental challenges with it, was this concept of Rumi turning this world into a prison, and envisioning this other world that we are. This is the way we want to set apart. Well, we want to set ourselves free from this one and move toward that life. And this talk of yours kind of hit on multiple ends, kind of assuming that portion and building beyond on that. It seems for me that seeing this world as a prison, it's more like a safe mechanism for people to not face the realism of the world. It's like it's a defense mechanism of some sort. And you touched on it in several points of your talk about how in the hard moments, this is a way of people finding meaning. There's a Sherman example you brought up, the friends who had challenges with their life-threatening challenges, But like the thing that you didn't mention was, for instance, the Shamans who face these situations. Many of them, there are documentaries on Christians, people of faith, even the ones who believe in spirituality. When these moments of hardship comes, they cannot, they lose the meaning. They lose the meaning of life. Old ways don't do justice. The religious ones, these ones, do not serve them. Do not act as a moving force for them. And I don't know, like for you, and you did mention that perseverance on the path. You brought the comparison of like in the company side. If you're pursuing that path, it will lead to success. I kind of disagree with that. Sorry, for me it's like, when you hit the failure, I think it's a nice way of justifying the conclusion, bringing that perseverance, the path, and success with the word. But I think it's more like, hey, maybe we are seeing this thing wrong, and it's a time to change the way that we see it. The old ways don't do help for us to, like, we gotta change it, and beating the same beat, it's not gonna get us any further away. No, maybe there's not this outer agency who's gonna do I don't know, there's no outer force, there's no outer hand. We gotta be responsible for ourselves. And as you definitely know, many of these spiritual teachings, the religions, have helped human beings in the hard times, when they were like the followers of Moses. They were held hostages. Of course, religion acted as a way to help them to persevere. But do we need them these days anymore? Or should we, at some point, come to the fact that, hey, we have to be responsible, see things as they are, don't create these imaginary worlds, and make them more complex, add to the dimensions, and like making them unspoken. Sorry, I kind of brought up the whole map of stuff here, but
I think first of all, in terms of like the old teachings, there's a lot of old teachings that have been recorded because people had at the time great revelations, great realizations that helped the people of their time. But like you say, we're living in a different time. Do those things still apply? And you could say, in many ways, they don't. I mean, it's like the rivers of spirit that ran through them at the time were meaningful, but it's not the same. The world has changed. Our experiences have changed. And so you can talk about people that are teaching, like some shamans are teaching an old teaching. But when I'm referring to the shamans, I'm talking about a different type of shaman. It's one who knows not about their teaching, but they recognize in another person a situation. And there are those who, even within their own teaching, they still recognize. So, but here's the thing. In the shamans, most of the shamans, back in the old days, not today, but back in the original times when they weren't picked by the group or their tribe, they usually experienced so many problems themselves that they became aware of how to get beyond those problems because they had to do it over and over again. They were often called the wounded ones because they had experienced such serious problems. So when somebody else comes to them, they knew what they were facing. They could relate to what they were facing, and that's why they became kind of a person that was called a shaman by others. They would come to them. From them, that's different. It's not about teaching. It's not about teaching. It's about knowing how to face the situation. And the thing that's interesting about the heart of this is, if we're facing something that we do not understand, then what can we do to solve that if we don't know?
But that's the thing. So it feels like there's a concept called God of the void. God is present whenever we don't understand a concept, but then when we understand that concept, that God shrinks. Feels like spirituality kind of touches on that too. It's like it's the unknown field, so let's cut it. Be like that's beyond, because at this point in time we don't understand it.
Right.
We create illusions, meanings, concepts around it, which don't necessarily, in my belief, they don't serve you benefits. Sure, it might make the hard times easier to endure. But it doesn't help with you facing the reality that, hey, this problem exists.
So one of my books is called The Lenses of Perception.
Which,
Yes.
I love it.
And so what you're talking about there, these the ways that you, once you understand, that's the third person lens. Now you can see it objectively. Now you can understand it with your mind, right? But that doesn't always make it help you understand what it's really. And you're saying that understanding that you learn at a deeper level that goes beyond that is something that can sometimes get closed down with the mind. And a lot of things, if you follow the teachings, you can see a spiritual founder of a religion, for example, often has a tremendous revelation of some kind. But then it becomes turned into a doctrine, and the doctrine becomes fixed. And in many ways, that teaching becomes frozen. And so there is, in India, there is a group of teachers, it's called Sant Mat, which means the path of the masters. And the usual meaning of that is they suggest finding a living teacher, not one that's died. But the deeper meaning of it is follow the same path that the masters follow. Not teaching about them, but their experience, which was discovery, experience, realization, and not these thoughts that get formed after the fact. I was mentioning this the other day, but if you look at all the books that come out, there's all these books on there of how I succeeded, how I accomplished this. They're all written after the fact. I was successful, and here's how I did it, A, B, C, D, right? It's all written after the fact. But what we're talking about here is facing the situation we do not yet know. That's where this experience of dying in our knowledge, dying in what we think we know, letting go, giving up to something that moves us out of that. If we can learn that, then we can face anything. We can face any experience. And that's not the third person lens doesn't work that way. Yeah. Yes?
I have a question about transfigurations, the experience that you talked about that Ruby described of him being a plant and then an animal and then a human being and then being an angel. If you go back before the plant experience, is there intelligence or consciousness in inanimate objects? Because if you look at nature, right, it seems to be more intelligent than a lot of human beings I've seen, right? If you look at land and sea, and not the metaphorical land and sea, we're talking about the physical land and sea, the way it interacts and balances itself out to create conditions for life or survive. And if you look at the solar cycles, the wind cycles, it's all operating in harmony to propagate and stay in some condition. And even in classical physics, if you look at it in quantum physics, atoms and molecules behave as if they're operating in a space of what possibilities exist. And depending on what stimulus it gets, the atoms and molecules seem to exhibit choice and show some sign of intelligence. Is there consciousness, is there intelligence right from that point on going forward? And if there is, then do those atoms and molecules make choices, or is it just pre-programmed so that whether we make choices or no, it's not going to be any different? We can enjoy the experiences, but so be it, and we just move on.
So first of all, in my book, Lens of Perception, I actually talk about that very subject you're talking about. And one of the things I can tell you is science has proven that it's not pre-programmed. The reactions of molecules, of particles at their basic things is not pre-programmed. And that's the part that's so confusing about quantum physics. Then why do they do what they do? And the scientists, the best they can come up with is it's random, which means I don't know. But the fact is, I do think the way that explains it the best is to say they are sentient in some way. They are have some spark of consciousness. And because then when you look at what they're doing, it makes all the sense. It makes sense, the choices that they make. They do make choices. And if quantum mechanics really faces that situation, why a particle has all these choices, why does it choose one? And if you think about it as being conscious, then it makes sense. Now, I believe Rumi's poem does refer to that. In the very beginning, it's inanimate, and then it becomes animate. So I think his answer is the same. That. I have to go back and look at that again, but I believe that's what his answer was too. So, yes, in the back row, yeah.
I was wondering what your opinion is on how someone feels about synchronicity. So this, this curious dance of this heart-space feeling correlated with happenstance and event. So many times it's blown my mind. It's so unimaginable that feeling and intuition can correlate so directly with the physical life around us. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and I've actually given talks on that subject. The term synchronicity was started by Carl Jung, a psychologist, and to give a sense of it, he's basically saying how things that seem unrelated could happen together in such a meaningful way that you can say, this can't be a mistake. This is something else. It means something else. And I love telling this story, but he was dealing with a patient who herself had a very scientific way of thinking and couldn't stop thinking about things very significantly. And so when he was trying to talk to her about the unconscious and the subconscious and the way it works and how there's more than that, she's going, yeah, I don't believe you and that stuff. And then one day she came in and she said, okay, I had a dream. So show me how this means something more, show me. And in this dream, she saw Carl Jung, and he was giving her a golden scarab. He says, so tell me what that means. Now, while Carl Jung is talking, there's this scratching noise at the window. And so he's talking and he's scratching and he's trying to ignore it. Finally, he realizes he can't ignore it anymore. He goes over to look at the window. He opens it up, and in comes this gold scarab-looking bug. He pulls it in his hand and he says, here's your golden scarab. And she just freaked out. Just said, oh my God. And she realized nothing in the mind could explain that. That experience was something like that. And the thing you have to understand is science is based upon things that are repeatable. All the scientific laws, all the scientific discoveries are based upon things that are repeatable. You can do over and over again. Anybody can do it. Then you know it's a scientific law. Synchronicity is all about those moments that happen once. And they're so special because they happened. Science can't tell us anything about that. What we have to go by is our own understanding. What does it mean to us? And that meaning is the real meaning. Yeah.
I have a firm belief that you can't force anyone down a path, the same as you can't force anyone to start working out. But I'm trying to start a self-help club in my high school. And these children, they're so far away from thinking about the idea of death or self-progress or anything like that. I was just wondering, what are some questions that I can pose to them so they get interested in the subject by themselves? I don't want to force anything upon them. Same with any doctrine that you mentioned, just getting them thinking about these ideas.
Yeah.
How should I go about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know if I have the answer, but I can tell you one of the things that is often being faced at the age you're talking about is social death. Being excommunicated, being not accepted, being treated as an outsider or being rejected. And that's very much as strong an experience as when old people get ready to face their death. It's just as meaningful to them. They do not want to be rejected. They do not want to be meaningful. And yet, being able to stand in their own truth and be going through that experience is just as a change, brings a change about them. I formed a group with another friend in high school. And one of the things we did was we actually tended to invite those who I called the misfits, those who didn't feel that they fit in any clique or group. And we basically invited some of the people that no one would invite into their groups. And they just, the meaning, it meant so much to them. But I think that facing social death is, for a person as going through school at a certain age, is just as meaningful and is filled with just as much potential for a spiritual breakthrough to be able to do that. Yeah, it's just a thought, anyway. Other questions? Yes?
So if I want to take one sentence from your speech was that when you are called, you have to do something. So what if you don't realize that you are called? Or what if you don't do what you have to do? What would happen?
Yeah, it usually doesn't just leave you alone. It usually, something else comes to make it clear you have to do something. And sometimes it's just within yourself. You just realize, I can't go on like this. I have to. It just feels like too much suffering. And you want to find something else. For people that can ignore it, then their life, the opportunity goes by. But sometimes, years later, they had this experience when they were younger, and then years later, it comes back to them again. But if you can ignore it and get away with ignoring it, then it's not the same thing. Because I'm saying you can't, it comes back at you. It won't let you go. But the thing is, you feel so much better when you go with it, when you start to listen to it, when you begin to accept, okay, this is different for me. I am not like, as Rumi said, I'm not like all of you. I can't live that way. I think that's when you recognize, and in that is a kind of a wakening up. It's not always a good feeling that you're different, right? But anyway, somebody over here. Yes, you had a question? Yeah, oh, no, okay. Yes.
Is it ever too early for a spiritual path? Because sometimes children are so content with growing up, and before maybe the age of adolescence where they have to deal with coming of age. As a child, you never see children asking about a lot of deep spiritual aspects. They just keep going down deeper and deeper into why, asking more about their parents. But is it ever too early for a spiritual calling or something like that? Should it ever be posed by anyone else?
I'd say yes and no. There's both sides to it. And in a sense that giving them a formal spiritual teaching is often not what they need when they're younger. What they often need is spiritual lessons and stories that they can relate to. And if you look at the stories that they're drawn to read about or listen to, they often contain elements. It may mean like facing dangerous situations or learning how to deal with something in a story. And it's often better in stories. There is a teacher who started a school called the Waldorf School. His name is Steiner, and he's German. And he taught, this school system started in Germany, spread across the world. What they taught, he said, is that he felt that younger children at a certain age were going through a stage that was similar to what mankind went through in its evolution. So he started off kids in their kindergarten type level, the first grade and kindergarten, with fairy tales. And that's the way he taught them, was fairy tales, because mankind basically believed in those kinds of things back in the early days. And then in the next year, it became myths, the Greek myths or the Nordic myths or the different myths from the different ancient civilizations, because that actually was meaningful to them at a level that meant something to them, very similar to what is meaningful to the children at their stage. And it was only when they became the 8th or 9th grade did they actually start studying modern teachings, because that by then they were actually able to start to relate to them, and they were meaningful to them, they were useful to them. So when they got through all that, they didn't just have an understanding of what modern thinking is, but actually an understanding of what all the histories have brought and all the lessons, many different levels. But yes. Anything else? Anybody else have a question? Or? Okay, very good. Thank you.